Hey everyone. We've talked at length about the test of time and how important that is in the humanities, particularly English. We've talked about how most of the books in the 5-year period between 1947 and 1952 have been forgotten. We've talked about why. What is it? Well, all of those people in that period were striving for genius. They were striving to say something permanent, something that they can contribute to the human condition. And unfortunately, as is life, most of them didn't succeed. They really said something important, but not as important as Salinger did. Salinger hit a nerve that we're still trying to cope with and grapple with. And so we've talked about that. And we talked in class about Plato's allegory of the cave. And I want you to really wrap your mind around this. Plato's allegory of the cave, we think, was approximately 380 BC. So well over 2,000 years ago. I want you to imagine what it takes, what kind of genius it takes to put forth an idea or a question. Either one, doesn't matter. An idea or a question, an answer or a solution or a question that we've never forgotten in over 2,000 years. And imagine the legion, the enormous quantity of people who tried for genius and did just a phenomenal job, but were nonetheless forgotten. I don't think I did justice to Plato's allegory of the cave. I don't. I would like to bring you, I'd like to scaffold down or bring down to you the idea of Plato's allegory of the cave, but I don't think I'm up for the job. It's too big. The best minds of hundreds and thousands of years have tried to grapple with this, and they've never solved it. If they solved it, we would have moved on and eventually forgotten it. So I can't even describe to you the complexity and beauty of what Plato and Socrates did. And if I can't do that with Plato and Socrates, how could I do that with the Garden of Eden? It's laughable for me to even try to bring to decode and unpack what's going on in this story, because this is, first off, this is not by itself a pro-Christian or a pro-Jewish statement that the Garden of Eden is beautiful. This story is important to, at minimum, 7 religions, and as obscure as Zoroastrianism, they've clung to this story and never been able to decode it. It's at the spinal cord of the human condition, and I can't help to do this story. I can't do this story justice. I would have never mentioned it if it weren't for a professor out of University of Toronto named Jordan Peterson. He's an individual who I have the utmost respect for. I model who I would like to be when I'm 55 off of this gentleman. A lot of what I'm going to say is taken from him. What I'm about to say is not my own ideas. But he's helped me understand the enormity of this story, and I hope to give you parts of it. There's no way I'm going to be happy with how I bring this story to you. It's too old. According to Peterson, it is likely that this is an excess of 10,000 years old, and very provably 25,000 years old. Can you imagine saying something today in 2017 that people still talk about 25,000 years from now? Get out of town. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. So if I understand 10% of this story and I can bring to you 2%, then as silly as that is, I'm happy to have done it. Okay. Before I pick apart some of the stories of some of the aspects of the Garden of Eden, I want to first say that this is not a necessarily pro-Christian, pro-Jewish, pro-Zoroastrianism, pro-anything argument. Let's look at this as a literature document, as a story. And so this is not going to be, some of you have been born and raised in the church, this is not going to be reminiscent of that. What I'm going to say is not going to remind you of some of the ideas that you've heard of going forward. I'm not going to, what I'm about to say is not to replace that. Hopefully it's something to add to that, because you've been told already the story is important if you grew up in the church. I hope to show you from a scientific perspective that this is valuable too. From a pure science perspective, this is incredibly valuable, and hopefully this supports and elevates your understanding of the story rather than replacing it. I'd like to add to rather than strip down and replace, okay? So with that said, in the story, chapter 2, verse 15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work and to take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat of it, you will surely die." There's so much to unpack from this part alone. It is not clear that a deer in the forest can die. And I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous. But if you lack self-awareness, it seems logical that the cessation or end of your life would not necessarily come to you as some sort of dreaded or tragic thing. Tragedy appears to require self-consciousness. And here's what I mean. No, I can't even unpack that. An animal, when it dies, is a little bit like a pig in scientific experiments that's put in a room with carbon monoxide. They've been able to study pigs as they've lost oxygenation in their brain, and it seems quite clear that they're unaware that they're dying, because the carbon monoxide shuts down their sense of self. And if you don't have a sense of self, death feels like you're falling asleep. That's it. And so when this God figure, this symbolic or literal God, however you want to take this, says that if you eat of the knowledge of good and evil, if you eat of the knowledge that gives you a sense of perception and knowledge of what is right and wrong for you, for others, for yourself and others, that you will gain the awareness that it takes to know that you're dying when you die. So this God figure from this text isn't lying when they say that increased knowledge is the birth of death. That if you gain enough self-awareness, then you will recognize when you're dying or when someone else is dying. And to come full circle again, in laboratory settings, when they shut off a pig's sense of personal identity and self, it is unaware that it's dying, and it's indistinguishable from sleep. So to start, we know that the apple represents knowledge, not death. But this God figure is not lying when they say that if you transcend and understand the difference between good and evil, that death will begin. I hope I'm making sense. So, in this situation, God created man, put them in a blissful situation, and said, continue living in bliss. Just don't eat of this apple. Well, in a couple verses, we see that mankind is alone, which is true. It took modern science to realize that man, if put in a vacuum, in other words, put in a situation in, let's say, solitary confinement, they go insane. Okay? It's not a leap to figure out that ancient people 25,000 years ago could determine this. If you're by yourself for long enough, crap happens, okay? And that's acknowledged in this text, that mankind in solitude is not good. They're a social animal. But we're still discovering to what extent we're social. So this is a very early discovery that humans are different than other animals. It's not clear that, let's say, pigs are social animals, that they go loopy or insane when they're by themselves. And there's a pattern emerging here as I show you this, that there's a scientific basis for this story, that there's scientific proof that what the story is saying is true, but what's mystifying is how they knew that 25,000 years ago. Okay, let's keep continuing. Next up, God commands Adam to name the animals. And the connotation or the implication there is that man has dominion over or control over the animal kingdom. Now, think about what you've heard about in your biology classes, about how we're an apex predator, or we're the top of the pecking order, and we're in control. 25,000 years ago, that would not have been immediately apparent. We'd have died at the drop of a hat. Okay, but back then, what's being stated here is that not only are we in charge in the apex predators, but the world has been created for us, which is symbolic for saying that the world is ours to manipulate, not the opposite being the world is manipulating us, which is happening with every other animal in the world. Every other animal, the world manipulates them. And we are, as humans, as the apex predator, from a purely biological standpoint, we are on top of that pecking order. And we're the sole thing that can manipulate the world. And if you think that's not correct, think about how in modern times we're saying we're destroying the planet. We are powerful enough that we can destroy the very orb that we live on. Okay? Moving along. God created a helper for Adam. And if I remember, I'll come back to this point, because this may be the one thing that science has disproven. This text says that woman came from man, and it appears as though, with modern science, we can determine that the gender of female came first. Asexual reproduction came first, and that a woman went back when we were amoebas and whatnot, a woman was asexually reproducing with herself. So a woman created masculinity within her and fertilized herself. Now, we'll come back to that if I remember, but almost everything else is scientifically proven in the last 100 years using all of the science that we have. And once again, the mystifying factor is, how did they know that back? If you're being a super skeptic 5,000 years ago, how did they know that 5,000 years ago? And if you're being perhaps open-minded or liberal in your interpretation, how did they know it's 25,000 years ago? The idea that woman came from a rib of Adam, I don't want to dwell on too much because it's inappropriate, but of all things, a woman could have come from a man's ear. In the story, the woman could have come from the man's brain. God could have taken a part of the brain out and made woman out of it, out of the soul, spirit, heart. Why rib? A rib is a phallic symbol. A rib is symbolic of the man parts. Okay, so the idea that the woman came from a rib is saying that sexually, through sexual reproduction, a woman was born. Okay. Now, moving on to chapter 3, the serpent tempted Eve. And he legitimately tricked her. In other words, mankind, when they looked at nature, was deceived. And that is biased. I think that this text supposes God. And so I think the implication is if man had looked to God, they would not have been deceived. But here man is looking to nature, the serpent, a natural thing, the earth, the material world. And while staring at the material world, they're deceived into thinking that everything is material. And so that's certainly biased and not necessarily coming from a scientific perspective. But the serpent plays on this idea of death. And we covered this already. God didn't necessarily lie when he said that if you eat of the knowledge of self, or the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of a transcendental moral rubric, that you would start dying because the awareness of death makes it so. So he plays with this. He says, well, God sort of gave you a white lie, if you want to go there. You won't die. He says, you won't die. God's lying. You won't die. You'll just know what God knows. And very intriguingly, this story does not create a weak enemy. This story creates a very smart enemy that's essentially correct. The knowledge of good and evil does make you godlike. It made humans godlike over the world. We have godlike abilities over everything that we see. We can reverse the flow of the Chicago River. That's godlike. Okay? And it came from from knowledge. So the Satan figure is not lying. God's not lying. Satan's not lying. Wrap your mind around that. You won't die if you know. God just wants to keep you from knowing what he knows because he's jealous and he wants to keep all of the knowledge to himself. Now, a lot of people read this story as being anti-woman, because in a moment we'll read that the woman's the one who made the sin, the mistake, and tricked man. I think that that's a modern interpretation, to look back on the past and think that the past is patriarchal and male-centered. No. We've talked about how important or how good women are at the subjective internal universe. It would be the woman who's if the woman is essentially more adept or capable at the internal subjective world that happens inside of the head, it would be the woman who would seek to better herself and become more feminine. So the idea that she's the one who took the apple, it makes sense. The man was perfectly happy and good at manipulating the objective world. So it wouldn't be likely to be him who would eat the apple first, because the apple doesn't make the male more male. The apple could make the female more female, though, and so she eats of it first. And so it says in verse 6, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took it and ate it. And then she gave it to Adam, and their eyes were both opened. Now, this is where it gets way above my head, and I don't know how to really approach this. But science, the very scientists who are likely to distrust a story like this, have come to the conclusion that the reason remember, science is very very motivated to find a reason for our existence that does not require the faith of God. Okay? And that's fine. That's fine. They're hoping to show that we came about through evolutionary processes. And that's a great enterprise. Let's see what we can prove, right? Independently of religion, they've thrown away religion, and they've said, well, how could we come about if it was chance and if it was just an evolutionary process? And the reason that they believe that we got our sense of color perception, right? Why can we see colors? Well, how did that help us evolutionarily? Well, their concept is that we developed our ability to see colors because if we could see colors 1,000,000 years ago, we could differentiate fruit from other colored fruit, which tends to be colored. Think of every fruit you've ever heard. There's color to it. Differentiating that from the surrounding foliage and rocks and things like that. Those of us who could see color could access the glucose from fruits. And those who could access glucose survived to a vastly greater quantity. So here we have a story where fruit, the knowledge of fruit, helped humans in some capacity. Well, what's going on here? Science also says that our visual cortex, our eyes, our ability to see and hyperfocus and see multiple colors requires 1/3 of our brain's capacity. So when we developed the ability to see colors, our brains increased in size by 1/3. Okay, that's okay, Mr. Hart. Fine. I'm losing the narrative here. What's your point? Do you recall that when they ate the fruit, that their punishment was pain in childbirth? What that means is they knew that fruit caused their brain to increase in size by 30%, which made their heads larger, which meant that passing a child through the birthing canal would be radically more painful. How did they know that? How did they know that when mankind first saw fruit and ate it, that their brains got bigger and made childbirth more painful? How did they know that? Apes don't have the same pain in childbirth that we do. And this is something that's above my head. Option one, coincidence. They had no idea. This is just random chance that the story was written this way. Option number two was they were way more scientific and way more understanding of the development of humans than we give them credit for. I fall into the second category now because of Jordan Peterson. Because there are several other instances in this story that show a supreme understanding of the evolutionary development of human beings. That's Lucy, my dog. Okay. Now we're going to come back to a little bit how this helps us with our class. When they ate of the knowledge and became smart, they knew that they were naked. And this is one of many, 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 many reasons why we've not forgotten this story. Why is it this story is so important? Because every human being goes through a Garden of Eden, eating the apple, becoming an adult story. For some of you, for me, I'll talk personally. I lived in a state of childlike innocence until I found out my parents made a mistake. I had wonderful parents. They were incredibly smart, and you're not going to believe this. But the first time my dad said something I knew was wrong was when I was 18. I take that for what it's worth. For me, learning that my dad had said something wrong was my Apple moment. That day, I realized that my innocence can't go on. I'm no longer in a Garden of Eden because my dad makes mistakes. And for you, it could be completely different. Maybe it's when your parents separated. Maybe it's when your uncle died. Something happened to you where you ate of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and you had to leave your childhood behind. And so it's very important that when you notice, as soon as they ate the apple, they knew that they were naked. What's going on? A child can run around your house naked. A child can run out in the front yard naked, and they don't care, because they don't know the difference between good and evil. They don't know what's wrong about that. They don't know about sexual predators and shame. They don't know any of that. So in their childlike innocence, it does not matter to them, and they can't be held accountable for either. If Eddie, when he's 3, if he runs out into a family party naked, I can't swat him or ground him. He doesn't have the capacity. He does not have the knowledge that that's a wrong thing to do. So when they eat of the apple, it is very appropriate that they knew that they were naked, because for the first time ever, they knew that was something regrettable. And there's something very important about this. There's something evolutionary just embedded in this, if you really think about it. They're coming from an animalistic state. Do dogs know that they're naked? Do monkeys know that they're naked? No, they could care less. They don't think about that at all. So there's something. This story is trying to say that there's something about mankind that transcended the animal kingdom, and that's what makes it Platonist. This story is saying that we're not material, and that when we ate of the tree of good and evil, we became transcendental, and we're no longer an animal. We can no longer walk around naked. And so, regardless of whether or not you ascribe to this story and think that it's true in a spiritual sense, we have to take it seriously that this text is taking a Platonist philosophical standpoint. That we're not merely humans. So there's something more to us than that. Now, it's true that Adam blamed Eve. He goes, she made me do it. And that's exactly what, I don't know. I mean, the woman is the one who stands to gain from the knowledge of good and evil. If in theory, and so it's the man is not as aware of why the fruit was beneficial. So he goes, I don't know, she did it. Okay, that's not something that's saying that the woman's lesser. Okay, it's true that the story said that she came from his rib. And it's true that she's the one who made the mistake and ate it first, but Adam's not painted as the smart one here. He's painted as the younger brother who blames the older brother, because the older brother is the one who made the mistake. Okay, I think this may be one of the last things that I say, but science has determined in the last, I believe, 50 years that the serpent or the snake began a long time ago with feet. That the snake used to have feet. And that over a long period of time, snakes needed to burrow into holes and the legs got in the way. And the snakes that had smaller and smaller feet could go farther and farther into holes. And over a long period of time, the snakes that had the smallest legs could survive by going into the holes to eat the mice. And over a very, 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 very long time, snakes devolved out of legs. This is not the Garden of Eden saying this, and I'll get to what's going on in a second. Science is saying this, that snakes used to have legs and now they don't. My question to you is this: at minimum, if you're a skeptic, 5,000 years ago, how did they know this? And if you're open to the idea that oral traditions can last 25,000 years, which has been demonstrably proven to be true, how did they know 25,000 years ago that the snake had legs and devolved out of them? I'm not asking or telling you as a teacher. I'm a student here with this text. How did they know? Because let's read this. The snake, because it tricked humans, was cursed by God. And God says, snake, you're going to creep around from now on. Your legs are gone. I'm taking your legs from you. You're going to slither because you're a creepy little thing and you're going to slither like a creepy thing. That's all from verse 14. How did they know? How did they know that the snake used to have legs? And once again, I guess I have to say, coincidence? Or they were much more scientific back then and much more objective and scientific methody than we give them credit for, okay? I'm on the fence. I really am. I'm really on the fence. And then we get to the part where the woman's curse is that she's going to have more pain in childbirth. Well, we already covered this. That humans who could see red, their brains increased in size by 30%. And if your brain increases by 30%, your head size increases by 30%, and the pain of giving birth exponentially increases. How did they know that? Coincidence? Or they were much more scientifically minded back then than we give them credit for. I won't dwell on this long, but it says that man will now have another curse is that man has to work for its food. It can't just pluck stuff off the tree like Willy Wonka anymore. You can't just grab something and eat it. Now you have to work for your food. You have to plant it and eat it. Well, just like the concept of death was born when man became knowledgeable, the concept of work was born when man became knowledgeable, because there's no evidence that squirrels know they're working. Squirrels are just doing squirrel stuff. Squirrels are running around doing stuff. It's just squirrely things. If the squirrel became self-conscious, then that work would no longer be possible in the way that it used to work. What used to be natural would now be a drudgery because it's a choice. That's the key. That's the key. That's complicated. I don't understand that. I don't understand it myself. And they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, which means they were permanently in a state of adulthood. I said if I remembered, I'd go back to the first part. The only part, this book seems startlingly close to the modern conception of evolutionary biology. Let's say there are 7 things that seem to jive with evolutionary biology. The one thing that doesn't is that woman came from man. At least at this point, we think that asexual reproduction, millions of years ago, started with femininity, that there were female organisms that impregnated themselves. Okay? Part of me thinks that, well, let's let the jury decide, because if this story is 6 sevenths correct, that one outlier maybe we're mistaken on. But maybe, who knows? Who knows? Maybe the technology we have available and the inferences we can make are essentially showing that females came first. Okay, I don't know. I really don't know. Okay. That's the best I can do, and this is not... Okay. This is the best I can do with Dr. Jordan Peterson's help from the University of Toronto. I just want to bring this whole story into full circle. We're studying it because of our interest in ignorance versus knowledge. Holden Caulfield leaving a state of innocence, perhaps because he was sexually molested, into a state of adulthood. Maybe it's too fast. Maybe you'll see, if we get a chance, we'll look at Emily Dickinson, the idea that if you're going to expose people to the truth of the sun or the truth of reality, you need to do it slowly. Maybe Holden, it happened to him too fast and he's being crushed to death by the weight of reality hitting him too fast. There's the idea of Plato, who was describing his own experience with living in the shadows, living with the masses, living in Golding's Tier 3, and being exposed to the knowledge of good and evil and how it changed his life fundamentally. And as he went back and tried to tell people what they're missing, he was literally killed. We have the idea of the prophet who's killed. We have the idea of Descartes, who's trying to strip away the shadows and look at what reality is. I feel that this story is a perfect segue between Holden Caulfield's experience with truth and with the masses and into the wild. So that's why we're studying this. And once again, I didn't do this story justice. No matter what I set out, I was going to feel frustrated with my ability to convey the messages of the story to you. It's somewhere between 5,000 and 25,000 years old, and I'm an ant compared to that. And anyhow, I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye now.